Welcome to Listening First, the podcast on rehabilitation and recovery. I'm Patrick Boyd.
And I'm Ben Marram. And for those who were listening really closely there, you might have noticed a slightly different jingle to introduce the episode today.
And that's because we're covering quite a special topic, something that's quite close to my heart, which is music, but not just music. We're looking at music therapy. But before we get into that, Ben, how are you?
Yeah, really good, thanks. Usual thing, Patrick, we're recording this at the end of the day, so kind of just coming down from the day as you do. But otherwise, yeah, really good. How are you?
I'm good, yeah. I haven't had a 3 o'clock coffee today, so I'm not feeling as caffeinated, which is a good thing. You know, I was thinking as we were planning this episode about kind of what led us to covering music therapy. You know, it was Remembrance Day not so long ago, and I attended a parade with my little girl who's in the Brownies, bless her. She was marching along with the rest of the Brownies to the music and all of the veterans, and it was really lovely to see. And the Brownies were not very well practiced at walking in time to the music, but they were doing the best that they could. It was really cute. But it took me back to, funnily enough, watching a video a while ago of a guy who'd sustained a brain injury and had relearned to walk through the power of music, through stepping in time with the cadence of the music. And I just thought that was really relevant to today because we've got an amazing guest who is a neurologic music therapist.
And I think it's probably helpful for our listeners as well to hear, Patrick, that you and I both are music fans. When we were setting a lot of this up, we ended up talking about music. You yourself, a drummer, me, a guitarist, or ex-guitarist, depending on which way you look at it. Hilariously, it reminded me of our deep discussion about the utility of the snare sound from Metallica's Saint Anger song, if people are familiar with that. If you're not, it's kind of famous in the metal world for dividing people on whether it's the greatest snare sound ever or simply the most terrible, and that's kind of where we're split, really, isn't it?
I'm very firmly on the side of it being an absolutely atrocious snare sound. How it ever got to a final recording is beyond me.
And I'm much more, it's kind of so bad. Is it actually genius? Is it actually what defines the song? And maybe Lars Ulrich, if you are listening, in the unlikely event that you're listening, you know, let us know your logic, or maybe come on as a guest. That would be quite outstanding, wouldn't it?
Can you imagine? You know what, by that metric, if something's so bad that it's actually good, then I should be a famous rock star by now, because my bands were always terrible.
Well, maybe, again, if people are listening to this and you're familiar with the Saint Anger snare sound, do please leave us a comment or send a message just letting us which side of the fence you sit on. We won't be taking points for who's right, but maybe when we review our year as podcast host, Patrick, over a pint at Christmas, maybe we could, count.
I think there's going to be more people on my side than yours, Ben, but we'll put that to one side for now. So yeah, today we've got a neurologic music therapist joining us, Elizabeth Nightingale from Nightingale NMT. So without further ado, I think we should allow Elizabeth to introduce herself. Elizabeth, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm Elizabeth. As you said, I'm a neurologic music therapist. So I specialise primarily in brain injury rehabilitation, but I also do work developmentally, working with birth injury clients as well. And I do work with kind of community as well as kind of in and outpatient. At the moment, I'm doing more community focused work, but I have historically worked in lots of different settings. So I have worked for Chiltern Music Therapy, and I also have my own business where I provide neurologic music therapy support, and I also provide expert witness support.
That's amazing. And we're really excited to have you on. I heard you speak at an event a few years ago now, and that's kind of, it stayed in my mind, that event, because if I'm being frank, and I think I said to you at the time, I'd not heard of a neurologic music therapist before. I'd heard of a music therapist, and I'd not known the difference. And I think what I was impressed about at that event was how you described some of the kind of tools and techniques and the training and the different ways you might be able to help people who have neurological injuries. So I wouldn't mind if you kind of, for our listeners, what is music therapy, or what's the difference, and how you got into neurologic music therapy?
Sure, yeah. So music therapy is a recognised allied health profession. So we are registered with the Health and Care Professions Council, and very much kind of sit alongside those kind of occupational therapy, physio, speech therapy. So even if people aren't aware of that, I always think that's important to communicate that we are allied health professionals, HCPC registered. So the pathway to training as a music therapy in the UK, certainly, that's typically a 2-year full-time master's. There are some part-time training options as well. And during that time, you will attend various clinical placements, as well as learn about kind of psychological theory, psychodynamic theory, and you will be learning sort of a whole range of different developmental theories and things like that. So it's very psychology informed traditionally, the music therapy masters. And during the training, we're really looking at how we use music to support in 4 main areas, really. So that might be around communication, it might be around cognitive skills, it might be supporting physical movement, and of course, well-being will be the one people will tend to often think about when they think about music therapy. But with music therapy itself, the interventions that we might use to support our clients aren't generally standardized. So we might be using things like songwriting, we might be using things like improvising, so creating kind of accessible opportunities to support nonverbal expression, but they're not sort of delivered as part of a standardized technique. So the research base for music therapy, as a result, some of that is more sort of qualitative in its sort of structure, essentially. But I am trained first and foremost as a music therapist. I actually trained as a Nordoff Robbins music therapist. So you may have heard of Nordoff Robbins, the music therapy charity.
Yeah.
So that is one of a number of approaches within music therapy, or a school of music therapy. I'm sure in different disciplines, they also have kind of various schools in terms of how that determines your approach to your work, etc. And then once you qualify, you can pursue additional specialist trainings, and one of those is neurologic music therapy. So neurologic music therapy itself isn't an approach, it's a system of techniques. So the training is provided by the Neurologic Music Therapy Academy, and NMT itself is made up of 20 standardized clinical techniques that essentially use music either for the purpose of training or retraining brain and behavior function in the areas of kind of speech and language, cognition, sensory motor, and psychosocial function. So we're either supporting kind of those developmental goals if we're working with kind of habilitation, or we might be working more rehabilitation. But there's also adaptive maintenance type goals and areas that we might support within neurologic music therapy as well. So essentially, NMT is kind of driven by advances in applied auditory music neuroscience, which is a kind of fancy way of saying it's based on what neuroscience has shown us about how the brain responds to music and how we can use that knowledge intentionally to support functional outcomes for our clients.
Amazing, yeah, and thanks for that. I think Patrick and I are both failed musicians. Patrick, as well, is that a fair statement?
I haven't quite come to terms with that yet, but I think I should probably accept that that's where I am now.
Well, I think one thing that is worth sharing, so neurologic music therapy, so you can complete your training. It's typically over sort of a 4-day period, but then you need to maintain a certain level of continued professional development or continuing education credits. There's a huge amount of free CPD and learning that's available for affiliates kind of globally. So we get together a couple of times a month in different forum spaces. There's neuro rehab forums linking you internationally with a whole range of kind of researchers, clinicians. So it's a great place to learn. But what's also exciting is you don't have to be a music therapist to attend the training. So when I did my training in the Netherlands initially in 2015, there were a number of speech therapists that attended that as well, a few OTs and physios, a couple of psychologists. I recently had the opportunity to support some of the core training in Estonia a couple of weeks ago, and there are a few Latvian psychologists that were attending the training as well. So you just receive a different designation. So you would receive an NMT AP or an NMT allied professional. So I always encourage other clinicians, if you're passionate about music, if you're curious and interested about ways you could either work more closely with NMTs when you have the opportunity, perhaps just develop your understanding more, or indeed consider ways you could be integrating within your scope of expertise music into your practice, it's a great training to consider attending.
Oh, Estonia as well. Never been to Estonia. How was it?
It was cold. It was cold. I forgot to pack a hat, which was an absolute rookie mistake. So I think I forgot that, yeah, -1 was not my friend, but it was beautiful, and actually getting to go into kind of the old town in the evenings was lovely. I haven't been sort of to that part of Europe really, so that was kind of new for me, but it reminded me slightly, I don't know if you've ever been to Bruges. Reminded me a little bit of that, like cobbled streets and kind of big tankards of beer and like kind of medieval looking restaurants, and like it was great.
I've got to say, Elizabeth,
Enjoyed it.
-1 is like t-shirt weather in the northeast for us. So, it's doesn't sound
Ah,
that worrying
okay.
to me.
Okay, maybe I've been overindulged. Well, never mind. But anyway, I thought it was cold, but it was lovely to be there, and really, yeah, exciting to connect with music therapists internationally who are kind of wanting to learn more about working with that system.
So before you joined us, Elizabeth, Ben and I were talking about the power of music in general and how it can be used for so many things, and it can be really therapeutic just for anybody, not necessarily somebody going through rehabilitation. And it made me
Hmm.
think about a film I saw not so long ago, which is called Soul. It's a Pixar movie, uh, and it's about largely jazz musicians, but there's a guy who's playing the piano, and he goes into this kind of trance like state, almost like he's transported to this empty space where it's just him and his piano. And it really
Mm.
made me think about how that's a perfect depiction of mindfulness when you're playing a musical instrument. I always remember when I used to play drums, I used to feel as though I was just in my own head. I wasn't thinking about anything else on earth apart from just the music that I was playing. And it was so valuable and cathartic for me. And I guess by the sounds of it, music therapy and NMT particularly are kind of tapping into the value of that while leaning on other disciplines as well, like psychology and neuroscience.
Absolutely. I mean, I think why I was so passionate and excited to train as a music therapist, just to kind of give a little bit of context of my personal story. I don't know if you remember like Richard Stilgo back in the day. He used to kind of present on TV, different shows and things like that, and music. And he set up a residential performing arts centre in Godstone called the Orpheus Centre. And actually, over the years, I've met at least 8 music therapists who volunteered there and ended up training as music therapists as a result of their experience there. So that was my first introduction, really, to seeing. And it wasn't NMT, it wasn't music therapy, but it was people passionate about the universal language of music and supporting people who are differently abled to express themselves in accessible means, in creative ways. And I was hugely touched and moved observing that and being part of that and getting to support that process. And I thought, wow, I'd love to do something like this. I think I could be good at it, and I think I would really enjoy it. And that's when I kind of went down a little rabbit hole and learned a little bit more about music therapy. So I think what I love is the thing that drew me to music therapy is supporting the person at the heart and supporting well-being and identity. But what I've loved through my NMT training is learning of all of the additional functional ways I can be holistic beyond the sort of the heart. I can also be looking at like the function and the speech and the cognitive skills and movement and all of that. And so that for me has been really exciting, that journey of being truly holistic in every sense of the word, and music getting to be a cool part of that, which is really exciting given that most people still think it's just someone shaking a tambourine or
Yeah.
something like that.
And as a
Mm.
neuropsychologist, I can understand things like memory formation and how powerful music can be in terms of, the whole network of the brain being used, both in
Hmm.
terms of how we listen, but if we're playing music as well, just the different areas we use it in. And I know you mentioned the sort of core 20 techniques of MNT, and I wonder if you wouldn't kind of, dare I say, is there a favourite technique you have? Is there one that's more successful? We maybe couldn't cover all 20, but in terms of tapping into that sort of neurological element, where's the neuroscience linked with some of the techniques?
Yeah, great question. So, for example, the sensory motor techniques. So there's 3 sensory motor techniques, and then there's 8 speech and language techniques and 9 cognitive techniques. But the sensory motor techniques, for example, we're really kind of drawing on research about the impact of rhythmic entrainment, auditory motor coupling, and how we can harness that to support things like gait training, to prime and cue movement. Those are the sorts of things that we're kind of drawing on in terms of the principles of how rhythm can support synchronicity in the body, all of those different things. So, and then if we're thinking about speech, for example, you might be familiar with melodic intonation therapy, which essentially is where we would be working perhaps with someone with Broca's aphasia, so damage to the left hemisphere language center. And we begin with that technique where it sort of follows a 6-step process where we essentially look at intoning phrases to assist with speech recovery. So we might use a really functional phrase, or it could be a social phrase like, how are you? Or I need the toilet, or something like that, depending on the setting and what's going to be meaningful and helpful for the patient at the time. And essentially what we would do through these various steps is we're looking to use engaging more of the right hemisphere singing, so the part of the brain that hasn't been impaired, to create our alternative to then begin trying to repair and restore and build a new neural kind of pathway, speech pathway. So that's been really exciting, working with patients who can't speak, but actually when we support them with scaffolding to sing and we follow this process, they can begin to hear themselves singing those simple phrases. And then we look over time to remove the exaggerated musical prosody to transfer back into functional speech. So it's a great example of using music very strategically as the functional tool to do the rehab and then taking it away. But in the means of doing the actual work together, that's an engaging exercise often for the client as well. So we can have this double benefit of the actual intervention is typically enjoyable, it's tapping into their strengths, but it also has this functional transfer. So I think that's been really exciting. And even working with clients perhaps who might not be a suitable candidate for that technique and perhaps present with other types of aphasia, there are techniques like musical speech stimulation, which essentially looks at triggering automatic speech through using overlearned familiar music because of how that is stored in the brain. And, we might just be as simple as singing a familiar song, leaving a gap at the end of the phrase, and actually finding we're providing an exercise to support them organizing their speech. And through that exercise and intervention, we do then sometimes see an increase in the spontaneous language thereafter. But again, for the client, they're being supported to sing a song which may also have all of these additional emotional benefits for them, etc. So it's quite exciting to use music functionally where I may have a specific goal, but there are, of course, all these additional experiences that the client may be having at the same time.
One thing I want to go back to is something Ben touched on just a few minutes ago, which was when we listen to music, it activates the total kind of neural network within the brain. It's not just a focal area of the brain that's activated. Can you explain a little bit more about that to us and how neurologic music therapy takes advantage of that?
Yeah, well, I think some of the things that have been really exciting with developments over like the last 15 years with neuroimaging, etc., and us understanding a lot more about, as you say, how music is processed in the brain in terms of that global activation. And essentially that allows us to be quite targeted in what parts of the brain we want to be stimulating, but even in the sense of giving our clients the best opportunity to respond and engage. And this is one thing I find really interesting at assessment as well, is looking at the same kind of task, and that's why joint working is so helpful. if I was to find a music-based way of assessing the same skill and we're stimulating more of the brain, do we observe any difference in terms of what we can deduce about the client's cognitive understanding, their potential, etc.? So it makes sense to me to give our clients the best opportunity to respond and engage, that we would stimulate as much of their brain as possible, and that will allow us to get kind of quite a rich picture of how they present, essentially, or how they can be presenting. So yes, I mean, I can share some examples that you might want to include in your notes. I don't know if you're including kind of notes with your podcast of different parts of the brain that are stimulated by different aspects of music. And I think that's because music isn't just one thing. We have, rhythm, dynamics, melody, movement, all of these different parts to music that are stimulated in different areas. And that's what we're really trying to capitalize on. Or in that example I gave with the language, okay, the left side speaking has been damaged, but singing, where we're engaging the right hemisphere more, that's still there. And actually, how fascinating that you're using a different part of the brain that we can kind of harness in a strategic way to support speech rehab as well.
Does that explain then how, just thinking about like some popular culture examples, the likes of Gareth Gates, who had a chronic stutter, was able to sing fluently, but in speech he really struggled?
That's a great example. Yeah, absolutely. And, it's not just supporting, with things like functional speech. I mean, another technique that I've used a lot in rehabilitation is musical mnemonics training, where essentially you're using music as a mnemonic device to sequence and organize information and add kind of meaning, pleasure, and motivation to enhance that person's ability to recall the information. If you think about, I don't know, historically, when you were at school or when you were studying for exams, you may have created little mnemonics or little kind of rhythmic turns to help you remember certain information. The reason that works, and the reason why, if you haven't heard a song for 20 years and you're driving in the car and suddenly they play the intro and before the first word you already know what the words are, is because musical memories are stored differently to verbal memories and they're retrieved differently as a result. So with that technique, we might be working with OT, for example, writing a step-by-step song for an upper body dressing sequence, or how to make a particular dish in the kitchen. And we support them with the song with the idea that over time they can internalize that. If they struggle with sequencing as a result of their brain injury, that is something that we might use those principles of how music memories will be laid down differently. So it's finding these different ways of using music to support in kind of really practical ways.
And it got me thinking there about, whilst I didn't use that technique to learn lots of neuropsychology stuff, I absolutely remember the music that I used to listen to during exam periods. If it was in the background, or when I was, the kind of music I listen to when I write reports, because kind of music's always a feature of my kind of background life, whether I'm driving, commuting, it's kind of always there. And it comes then, maybe it's kind of ironic that it's the Spotify Wrapped time, kind of where people are getting their year review music, that we're kind of reflecting on this about kind of what music means at different points in your life too, and kind of focusing on the emotional side there of like when people are in rehab as well, and these songs. I suppose my question around that is, with the people you work with, do you have like a selection of songs that you commonly go to, or is it very much tailored about the songs and music that the person likes? Do these techniques lend themselves to different styles of music?
That's a great question. Absolutely. Tailoring it to the client's kind of musical autobiography is really important, particularly when we're thinking about cultural preferences as well as kind of musical preferences and how all of that feeds into that person's identity. There are certain techniques like melodic intonation therapy where we're exaggerating the prosody of a phrase, so we're not using a familiar song in that instance, but there'll be lots of times where we might work within the framework of a particular technique, but we can utilize music that is preferred by the client, and if we know that that's going to help with motivation, that's crucial. And as you say, regardless of working on traditional functional outcomes, there's a huge part around psychological adjustment, supporting emotional expression, acceptance, where we might be using familiar music to support with some of that, sometimes different playlists to support with things like sleep hygiene, or it might be to support with mood regulation. There's a whole different range we might be pulling on musical preferences or different types of music to support them with different things. I mean, it's interesting you say the Spotify Wrapped, because I think the one profession that I feel gets an extremely eclectic result from that is a music therapist, because obviously like all year I'm playing whatever music is meaningful to my client, and then it gets to the end of the year and I've got sort of the most eclectic mix. And then also as a parent of a toddler, that I think I've had a couple of years where white noise has been my most played track, which I think is quite amusing and not necessarily reflective of my actual musical preferences. But
yeah, I was shocked when I was listening to my most played playlist, and Mary Poppins Step in Time was right up
amazing.
there.
I mean, I wonder, I don't know if you're familiar with the dementia charity Playlist for Life, but essentially they look at working with families and caregivers to establish early, a handful of meaningful songs that can be used to support and reach that person with dementia. And it has inspired like other initiatives and ideas. And it is an interesting thing to consider, what one song or what couple of songs would you want other people to know, that if in the incident you had a significant brain injury and they were wanting to reach you on some level when you were significantly impaired, what would be the song that you would want to hear? And like these are like profound questions, but interesting things to sort of reflect on as well. I don't know if something comes to mind for you immediately or whether that feels like a tricky question.
I think for me, I've got just a lot of songs that define different periods of my life, so I'd probably end up with a short playlist, really.
Yeah, same. I mean, there's so many different songs that form really strong memories for me, and I think one of the clearest memories for me that I link to a song is probably when my little girl was born, and the music that my wife had on in the background as she was giving birth. It's a really powerful song that sticks with me.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. Do you have a song, Elizabeth? Sorry. Do you have a song that...
I mean, that's a great question. I probably do have a few key songs that I return to a lot, but I think one of the things I find interesting about my job is ever more and more, not only do I have all of my own musical memories associated with my own experiences, but I might then be reintroduced to a song through a client, and then my memories are forever also attached to my experience of working with them. So it's a really interesting experience in terms of my own relationship with music and how that evolves. I remember years ago, what was the name of the band? It was Closing Time, the one. And he told me that that was their first dance at their wedding. So we'd been using it to work on a lot of like functional upper body stuff, essentially using kind of key rhythmic cues, but that was obviously highly motivating, working on some upper limb extension, etc. And we were doing an open ward session just because it was easier. We couldn't get another room at the time, and so the whole ward was like sort of singing along, willing him on whilst he was doing this. And I thought, wow, I'd remembered that song as a teenager, and now I've got all of these really beautiful memories of us singing this together on this unit.
And this feels like a weird thing to say, but obviously, if any of our listeners have particular songs, maybe share that in when we post this episode on LinkedIn. Because I think I like the associated memories. So if people have particular songs that mean something to them, about it prompts what it might mean for me. The classic one for me is Mr. Brightside by the Killers. And I'm not a huge Killers fan, but for me, Mr. Brightside is the definition of the perfect wedding song. And there's so many weddings that come to mind when I think about that particular song and those particular moments. So yeah, if our listeners wouldn't mind commenting some songs that maybe jump out to them, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, I remember Chilton Music Therapy did a lovely initiative a few years ago called Song for Life, kind of drawing on that idea, and people sort of could request these almost like a credit card sized it was a credit card essentially with Song for Life, and it said, in the instance that I have a brain injury, please play this song to reach me. and people could essentially write that and then it would be kept in your wallet. And I thought that was like such a beautiful idea of kind of really transferring that power of music out to people, because it's sometimes, you know, not until something like that happens that we're then thinking about that. And often in our work, I will have the opportunity to work really closely with families on gathering that information. But it's often interesting when we've done various pilot projects, maybe in NHS or inpatient settings. Actually, it's been a great learning piece with the team to consider gathering that kind of information on admission, and actually part of capturing, as well as understanding about their religious beliefs, their cultural beliefs, actually, where music could then not just be used by an NMT in that instance, but any music that then is used is going to be as tailored and person relevant as possible. So, yeah.
And kind of jump into another question, but on the point, because you mentioned an initial assessment there. What does an initial assessment with an NMT look like? And also, is there any groups that this approach is contraindicated with, or it just wouldn't work for, in terms of that could be severity of brain injury? Is there anything that would preclude someone from engaging in NMT?
Yeah, that's a great question. So all of the techniques are underpinned by something that's referred to as the transformational design model, or the TDM, and that is like a 6-step process. So step 1 is your diagnostic and functional clinical assessment of the client. Obviously, as music therapists, typically we're not qualified to diagnose, but we can be informed and have access to that diagnostic information to inform us in our work. Again, functional clinical assessment may be carried out together on admission as part of a client admission battery of assessments, or it might be indeed the NMT carries out a specific standardized assessment based on the reasons for referral. So that could be a communication assessment, it could be a motor assessment, etc. And then step 2, we look at setting the goals and objectives for the treatment. Then we're thinking through like a non-musical structure of how we would address that, or what that would look like in real world. And then we translate that into a music-based exercise within the framework of a relevant NMT technique. And then we look at reassessing and then any function every day. So essentially, an NMT assessment would typically be a non-musical period where we would be getting that initial baseline in order that we could then be as informed as possible for the selection of the techniques that are going to best support them for either rehab or maintaining or developmental, etc. So in terms of contraindication, no. I mean, that one advantage is music is non-harmful. So that's wonderful. And there are definitely protocols within certain techniques. For example, if we are working with prolonged disorders of consciousness, there's various guidance around, monitoring overstimulation responses and how we would then reduce that stimulation accordingly. So we would be working really with real sensitive observation at any point if we felt something was not appropriate for our clients. But I think because those techniques are covering such a broad scope, some of them are looking at psychological adjustments, some of them are looking at speech intelligibility, some of them are looking at developing receptive language for the first time. I do a lot of songwriting with my pediatrics cases where I'm supporting some of their educational learning, working closely with school and the curriculum and finding personally engaging ways to support them to learn new words. So there's a whole rich range of different types of goals we might be working on. So it feels like it can capture a huge amount, but of course there will be times where we might do something music-based that feels really valuable, but it might just not be NMT. But that doesn't mean it's not valuable. It might just be we're not doing NMT in that particular moment.
So, Elizabeth, from a case manager's perspective, I'm really interested to hear about the role of NMT and how that fits in with a broader MDT, because with a lot of the clients that I work with, I'll be instructing the likes of neuropsychology, physiotherapy, occupational therapy and speech therapy. But one might be forgiven for not always immediately going to an MT. So can you just explain how that fits in with somebody's broader rehabilitation program?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. We're often thought of as a nice to have, or we tend to be brought in way after everyone else has already been established and working, rather than being seen as a core component from the beginning. Some of that I think is education. Some of that might be a bit of a cultural thing as well. I think mostly around understanding the scope of what music can be doing functionally. So I would see, based on also the research, it really advocates for early intervention access, and in terms of the type of intensity, obviously that's something that can be looked at more closely when we're working in those earlier stages, and that might actually determine them not needing that kind of long term if we're coming in at the right time. So I think it's always worth consulting with an NMT therapist to ask about that and learn about a little bit more about the client and where they might be able to add value. But for me personally, I feel like NMT really sits at the heart of rehab, because we are perhaps the one profession that would have regular calls to be crossing over with every other discipline. So we have a handful of techniques that would be crossing over into supporting the psychosocial function, where we would want to be liaising and communicating, joint planning, setting goals with the psychologist, or identifying shared areas or separate areas for support. Similarly with speech therapy, where can we be reinforcing existing interventions they may be doing? Maybe they're going to be focusing more on dysphagia and swallowing, and we're going to be focusing more on some of the communication areas, but we definitely want to be drawing on their expertise and oversight for setting our goals, working really closely together. And then similarly with occupational therapy and physio, drawing on their expertise, we do a lot of joint working with those disciplines as well. So I feel like when NMT is done well, it really kind of sits at the heart with crossing over with all of those different areas, and can synthesize lots of different functional interventions into integrated experiences that are musically engaging for the client.
So with everything you've just said there, Elizabeth, about integrating or being at the heart of rehab, it would make sense that an MNT could lead an MDT or direct goals. Have you got any examples of where that might be appropriate, or like how often have you led an MDT or kind of been encouraged to lead an MDT and goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've definitely had a few experiences where that's worked really well, and particularly I'm thinking of case managed clients where we're working seeing the client at home. I've had a couple of pediatric cases where there have been, OT, physio, SLT, and myself, and psychology as well, mostly supporting family, but still very much part of the team and giving that oversight, where family were feeling quite overwhelmed with the amount of different separate therapy programs that they were needing to sort of support the client with throughout the week as part of working on those different functional areas, and support workers similarly feeling a bit overwhelmed with all the various different trainings to support the implementation of all of those programs. And so I've had a couple of occasions where I was then tasked with synthesizing and the therapy program into fewer highly engaging music-based exercises and tasks that integrated multiple goals into one. So it involved really close liaison with OT, physio, etc., speech therapy, psychology, but enabled to create that program that was meeting the needs of the team in terms of what we wanted to address and support the client, but that was more accessible, fun, and engaging. And ultimately, particularly with physical rehab, we know how important it is to get that intensity in. So anything that was going to make that feel more achievable and manageable for the family was really, really important, particularly if it, in its delivery, just felt like a fun, enjoyable activity that the family could be supporting with. So I think there have been some great examples of that in practice, where I've just been able to kind of work really closely with the other members of the team to help coordinate that particular piece.
Yeah, it's just really interesting. And sorry, Patrick, you look like you had a question.
That's really interesting, Elizabeth, and it makes me wonder if you can give us any real life examples of how you've supported people to achieve goals in those three main areas that you mentioned there, in the cognitive, sensory motor and the speech and language areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can think of an example where I was working with a young person who had a TBI, and they were primarily, well, there were a few different things they were struggling with, but particularly attending to tasks, which was obviously affecting them in therapy, but also when they were then returning or trying to return to college, being able to sustain attention, engage in that kind of environment was really challenging. So I worked quite closely with the occupational therapist, and one of the techniques that we used was called musical attention control training. And essentially, that is a music-based technique that uses live, active, or receptive exercises to practice different attention functions. So, for example, if we're thinking about, I mentioned in the transformational design model, we'd stop and think about the structure first before we translate that into a musical exercise. So if we were thinking about, what's an example of a focused attention task, it might be where, we're trying to have a phone call, but there's lots of surrounding noise that we need to not listen to in order to just focus on that particular words and conversation that we're having. Or we might have an example if we're thinking about alternating attention, what might be when we're rapidly alternating attention when we're driving. We don't just pay attention to the red light, we need to look at the passengers crossing the road, things like that, for example. Or selective attention when we need to listen out for a specific piece of information. Maybe we know that we're at the airport and we're listening out for our flight or whatever. So thinking about what's the non-musical structure, and then what would that look like in music, and how could we then practice that skill in a structured format, and then support that into sort of to carry over into every day. So with this particular client, we looked at various levels of increasingly challenging sustained attention tasks, and then began moving into some sort of selective and some alternating attention tasks as well. So in music, that might begin quite simple, where we would say, okay, when you hear this kind of music, I want you to play the drum. And then when you begin hearing the music sound like this, I want you to shift and be playing this other instrument. Now, that is an example of a more advanced, sustained attention, because they're still responding to everything, but from one source, which is me. And if I was to move to selective attention, I might give them a particular motif to listen out for and to do something that changes the behavior at the point they hear that motif. So we're practicing that idea of selecting attention or sustaining, etc. But again, for her, that was like really engaging. She was very motivated. And what was fascinating, back to thinking about the difference of using music in assessment, was in terms of her duration of attention was much higher when we were doing these kind of tasks, which then obviously also left us with, what recommendations could we make to the teacher of how to utilize music strategically to support her to attend? And how might we support her to alert her for the class? So even just listening to music for a few minutes before she goes into a class, lots of different ways we could then draw more broadly to support practically how to support her attention. But essentially doing the music to practice the skill. And then we begin looking at that transfer. Okay, now let's try this functional non-musical task. And do we observe changes at this point? And what was exciting with her is when we compared our pre and post assessments, we used a few assessments. One was the Montreal Cognitive assessment, where we could see those improvements in her attention, and the transfer. We're beginning to hear other therapists saying she's engaging for longer periods without needing a break. The class teachers are saying that she's needing less prompting and support. So quite exciting, practical outworking of us working with that kind of technique. So that's maybe a cognitive example I can share.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. And it made me think, when you were explaining there about that carryover and supporting people to make real functional improvements, it made me think of an analogy which, funnily enough, I recently shared on LinkedIn, of the the rainforest. I'm not sure whether you saw it. My mentor, when I first came into case management, explained to me about neuroplasticity and how neuroplasticity is essentially, we should think of neuroplasticity as though we were hovering above a rainforest in a helicopter looking at a perfect carpet of green trees below us. And that is the brain pre-injury. And then a brain injury happens, and that's in the form of a few of those trees being cut down and there being a blemish in the green carpet of trees, and those trees are gone and they're not going to grow back. But neuroplasticity is looking after the surrounding trees and eventually encouraging those trees to grow the branches to cover the hole and do the job that the trees that were once there were doing. It feels as though NMT is one of the tools that we could use to, if you like, look after those surrounding trees and encourage them to grow.
I absolutely love that as an illustration, because the only other one I've heard, and I feel like that was much better than the one I've heard, but the one that I've heard and would sometimes reference myself is that idea of an injury to the brain being represented by a traffic jam. You know, the normal A to B route has just been disrupted. We can't go that way anymore, but music providing that equivalent of the diversionary route through neuroplasticity, so to creating that alternative pathway in order to get to our destination. But I love that idea of kind of nurturing the surrounding trees and branches to kind of fill in that area. That's a great, I'll definitely steal that if that's all right.
In some of the training that I do with social work students, I explain about music therapy to help people achieve physical goals as well.
Yeah.
So can you give us an example of how you've supported somebody to achieve something more physical?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are three main techniques in the NMT system that address kind of the sensory motor. So one is rhythmic auditory stimulation, which is looking at gait training, so relearning to walk. And then the other two are therapeutic instrumental music performance and pattern sensory enhancement, essentially are looking at supporting functional movements for every day. So I've worked with clients, for example, who have got impaired fine motor control and maybe are wanting to return to work. And we might be working with a combination of music technology and instruments like a keyboard. And we might use one of the techniques called therapeutic instrumental music performance, where we select an instrument that's going to reproduce that functional movement pattern. So in the instance of them typing on a computer, again, like isolating keys on a piano keyboard is similarly using kind of different weighted keys, working on those kind of single digit isolations, but providing a really clear rhythmic structure to prime and cue the movement that they have to follow. And again, we can look at developing the complexity and speed of that task over time, and then have real world comparison where we're then looking at how that impacts that sort of functional typing skill. Or we might be working with somebody, I've worked with clients where they struggle to do a safe and consistent sit to stand. And some of that is because of sequencing challenges, as well as kind of their physical impairments. So we've created music using a technique called pattern sensory enhancement, which also uses the principle of rhythmic entrainment, but it also draws on how we can reflect the pacing, the shape and the contour of the movement using things like melody, pitch, dynamics, in terms of the size and energy of the movement. So I've created music before with some simple cues where we sort of got right hand, left hand pushing forward and up, and then we have the music ascending, but it's paced in a way that's safe and sustainable. And the idea, again, is that over time, the patient can internalize that melody. So when they're going to do a safe sit to stand over time, having practiced it numerous times, they now have an internal resource to draw on to support their safe pacing and execution of that movement sequence. So that would be an example of how we might work on those sort of functional movements. And then, of course, walking as well, we might be using rhythmic auditory stimulation. That typically involves a lot of close working with physio as well when we're looking at those areas. But that's drawing on that principle of rhythmic entrainment. I don't know if you're a runner or you guys like to exercise, but typically You'll find when you're listening to music, you'll want to kind of keep to the beat, or actually it's harder to run out of sync than it is to kind of fall in line. And that sort of happens at a sort of automatic, sort of subcortical level, but that can often be compromised by an injury to the brain. But we can retrain it externally using rhythm, again with the view to internalize it over time. And what we notice is, even with just adding really strong, clear rhythmic music that will be based on things we've observed at baseline in terms of identifying a suitable speed, we'll be looking at things like stride length, arm swing, all of those different aspects of the gait cycle. But we notice often an immediate difference in the weight shifting, the coordination of movement, the timing and the priming as soon as we add the rhythm, which is fascinating. And then when we then begin taking that away for short periods and then we add it back in, do we see it being carried over with the idea that patient can internalize that rhythm to support initiation of movement, or indeed more coordinated walking? It's kind of fascinating, really. There's some great videos online that I can recommend people watch as well if they want to see some examples of that in action.
And we'll include any of those in the show notes if listeners would like to see those, because I certainly would. I'd love to see some more examples of that. It's just absolutely fascinating, this, Elizabeth, and it definitely feels like a really clever way of tapping into you're doing two things, I suppose, aren't you? You're helping to rewire the brain internally, but you're also engaging the client in something that they actually enjoy. And from my perspective, when I manage teams of professionals around a client, sometimes the client will attach more value to an area of their program where they see more concrete progress, for example, physiotherapy, where it's an obvious improvement, whereas with the likes of psychology or occupational therapy, sometimes the benefits can be less obvious but equally as important. From your perspective, do you find that clients tend to buy into NMT more easily than they do with other elements of rehabilitation?
I think in my experience, yes, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think one, obviously, we've touched on that we're also really trying to shape interventions that are personally meaningful, drawing on their own music. So it's fun and engaging, but also because we're potentially trying to tap into unimpaired function, they often experience success with those tasks. And that can be really key for building confidence, building trust, supporting greater engagement, so that when then we do work on something that is more challenging, we've built that foundation of trust to kind of push and try something more difficult. So I think, I've been in sessions many times where I've seen the clients become very emotional because they've heard themselves say something for the first time following us doing something with music, and it's very moving, and it's something I don't take for granted, because I also recognize for some people who maybe don't consider themselves musical, or perhaps are a little bit inhibited or shy at the thought of doing music. But if I can explain in a really clear way before we start, regardless of your feelings about music, let me tell you about music and the brain. And let me tell you what's going to happen when we try this exercise and what's going to be stimulated. Let's try it and let's see if that does happen. Let's have a look together. And so I found often for some clients, giving a bit more of the rationale has been really helpful to support them to engage. I don't want to stereotype. I have tended to notice that more with my male clients, but that may just be my experience. But it's certainly been interesting learning there are clients who really want to understand before they're willing to engage in something that feels a bit different. And I think that's also really fair and important, and thinking about how we can include our clients in understanding why we're going to try that intervention in the first place.
And I think as you were talking there, I remember so distinctly the example you shared at the presentation I saw you do, Elizabeth, of a client saying "I love you" to I think it was their wife for the first time. Like, I remember that. I remember, I nearly cried my eyes out as well. And I remember I've only got one experience, sadly, of working with an NMT directly and an MDT. And what was more powerful in that client's journey was writing a song, writing lyrics to a song for one of their favourite songs, and actually seeing in real time how it pulled all of the different disciplines together. and more importantly, the family reaction to that moment. And I guess I was curious about, how does this approach fit with kind of family type work, or other over and above kind of those big impactful outcomes that, you know, families see their loved one grow and develop through therapy? Like, how does this approach fit with the family experience?
Yeah, well, I'm so pleased, like that stayed with you. That stayed with me too. It's definitely one of those kind of particularly profound clinical experiences I think will always stay with me. But yeah, in terms of family work, I think as well as sort of supporting them, you know, practically with things like home programs, building their confidence with how to utilize music in perhaps more functional ways, it's also about supporting the family system with ways to experience and share music that support and foster and nurture those relationships. And, you know, I've had many experiences where I might be working with an adult parent who's had a TBI, and I'm actually supporting working with the children of fun, accessible activities that daddy can do with you, and fostering and supporting and giving some scaffolding initially to allow those shared experiences together, and then maybe working with the other parent with a few ideas of some fun ways they can be using music together at home, or teaching them how to use different switches, recording in their voice, and then daddy can press it, and like finding all of these fun ways that they can actually feel included, and it doesn't feel threatening and intimidating, but we can make this feel fun and meaningful and enjoyable together. I've had some wonderful experiences recently working with a family where their grandparent had come over from overseas for 6 months, doesn't speak a word of English, but absolutely loves being in our sessions. And we have learned ourselves, you know, through gesture and tone, we have found ways of communicating. And it's been so lovely to support her to have these meaningful experiences with her grandson that don't rely on words, that don't rely on what he can't do, but is really kind of building on the things that he can do and working together with that. So I feel really passionately about not just supporting my clients specifically, but more broadly, like the family system around them, and how we can pull them in to not just supporting the actual functional rehab, but more broadly the culture of music in the home, and how we can equip and build confidence around the place that can have.
And I think that links directly back to a question that Ben asked you earlier today, which was around, you know, is there a particular type of music for a particular thing? The word you've just used there is culture. And I suppose so much of music is about culture, isn't it? And so you're tapping into things that are really important to certain people and working in a way that's familiar to them and that they value.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, that it's ever a learning day. Every day is a school day. You know, this is true for all of us, but particularly for me as an NMT, you know, I'm constantly being introduced to or engaging or learning so I can recreate music that is meaningful for that individual and finding ways to reach them. And that also is an interesting part of the work, because my clients regularly get to have an experience of teaching me something and introducing me to something. And that also feels like quite an important part of the dynamic of that relationship.
It's more of an exchange.
Yeah, I think so.
Fascinating. So one question that's burning in the back of my mind, Elizabeth, is if somebody doesn't have a pre-existing interest in music, then would that serve as a barrier to them engaging successfully in neurologic music therapy? Or is this a type of therapy that literally anybody can access and benefit from, regardless of whether they've been particularly interested in music?
I think that's a great question. So no, it's not a barrier at all, because really, even if someone doesn't play an instrument or doesn't particularly listen to music at home independently, their brain will still have been shaped and informed and exposed to music, and that will have an impact, and that's what we can be sort of drawing on. I mean, interestingly, it can be an advantage and disadvantage sometimes when I'm working with someone who does have a heavy musical background or a musician, because sometimes they can be very caught up in the aesthetic of what they're creating, which sometimes is then a psychological barrier we need to do another piece on to support them with, rather than being able to kind of work on it as a functional tool. They can be quite focused on, oh, it doesn't, my voice doesn't sound like this, or I'm struggling with this and I could do this before. So sometimes we've had to go back and do a bit more of work on this sort of psychological support, acceptance side before we then move into working with a medium that they obviously love, but finding a different way to use it to support them.
One of the things we've started to ask guests, which is a bit of a broader question, is maybe from an NMT perspective, but also for you personally, about what does rehabilitation mean to you, Elizabeth?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I've heard some good answers on this so far. I think I consider rehabilitation a process of growth and connection, not just repair. So sometimes it's about recovery, but I think in the case of some of my birth injury clients, where it's more that habilitation, so making space for learning, expression, and becoming. So we can work on function, but also nurturing relationships, identity, and family life, and that balance, I think, is what makes meaningful rehab. I last week was able to attend the Acquired Brain Injury London conference, and there was a lady there talking about her lived experience of brain injury, and she shared, recovery is a relationship you build with yourself. And I thought that was a really beautiful way of kind of capturing parts of rehabilitation, and that's something that stays with me.
Yeah, well, we can't thank you enough, Elizabeth. I've really enjoyed this discussion. How do people kind of find out more about your work?
So you can go on the Neurologic Music Therapy Academy website to find, you can find an affiliate, and you can just search under UK or by county there to find people who are registered affiliates. So that's www.nmtacademy.co. And if you're interested to reach out to me or wanting some signposting or even to talk about clients, you can find me on nightingale.nmt.co.uk.
One final question. If you want listeners to come away with one message, just one thing that you'd like them to remember from today, what would it be?
I would say music is the tool that we use to do the work. So regardless of what you think about music, don't be limited by your assumptions. Music can do far more than you think it might do.
And that's a perfect place to end it. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was absolutely amazing.
Thank you so much for having me. I really feel honoured to be invited on, so thank you.
I don't know about you, Ben, but that was just an unbelievable discussion.
Yeah, I think we'd referenced this right at the beginning, Patrick, that both of us love music. And in part, I was worried that I didn't want to kind of just say to Elizabeth, I love music, and Patrick loves music, and that's why I had you on, because that's not what it's about. But I think hearing Elizabeth talk about how universal music is and how it cuts through culture, language, particularly with some of the case examples she discussed in terms of working with people even where English might not be their first language, it just made total sense. And in part, I think when I first heard Elizabeth speak, it dawned on me how much I'd neglected the possibility of neurologic music therapy in a rehabilitation team. And again, that discussion, it just reminds me of how important that it shouldn't be a second or third decision for someone like yourself, like a case manager. It could be very much like a first line decision, depending on the family, the situation, or indeed just looking at someone's rehabilitation overall.
100%, and I'm right there with you. It's made me think about clients that I've worked with in the past where maybe there was a bit of a missed opportunity to get music therapy involved, and how it might have benefited that client. And indeed, I'm thinking now about current clients that I'm working with that could benefit from using an element of music therapy as part of their rehab. For me, one of the biggest takeaway messages is that you don't have to have an interest or a predisposition to enjoying music to benefit from music therapy. This idea that the fact that somebody doesn't have a natural interest in music would mean that it's a kind of a barrier to them engaging. It's just nonsense, because as Elizabeth so eloquently put it, we're all shaped by music in one way or another. Music is a part of all of our lives at some point, because it's so culturally relevant. Wherever you are in the world, there's an element of music that kind of shapes how you are and how your family is and how your society operates. So yeah, I mean, it's so much food for thought there.
Yeah, and I think we often talk about hard or soft outcomes in whether that's rehabilitation, habilitation, or generally it was more in statutory services we'd use that idea. So, soft outcomes are more qualitative results, niceties. Quantitative outcomes or hard outcomes are like real change on measures. And I think what I loved about Elizabeth' approach and what she talked about in terms of NMT is that it is absolutely both, that it can be, I think music therapy has always been known for its softer outcomes and its meaning, but actually what Elizabeth was talking about was these real measurable, changeable outcomes using techniques in NMT, which makes it much more, I think, in the future, we can really evidence the effectiveness of this type of approach. But for me, ultimately, regardless of outcome, it's about the meaning that people derive from the intervention. And actually, she was talking about the case examples and me thinking about working with an NMT on one of my cases. It was the meaning for the person, for the family, and for the network around them. That was so important and just massive. And really, isn't that what, we talk about what's rehab all about? For me, that's what rehab is all about. Rehab is about change and about these amazing outcomes for people, regardless of whether they're hard or soft.
Brilliant. Thank you again so much to Elizabeth for joining us today. And we really hope you, our listeners, enjoyed that episode. We'd absolutely love to hear from you and hear any feedback that you might like to offer us, good or bad. We're really keen to continue improving this podcast and making it something that's really worthwhile for everyone, our whole community. So please don't be afraid to get in touch. We've already had some brilliant feedback and comments, and thank you to everyone who has been getting in touch. We read all of the feedback that we receive and we're very grateful for it. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so by emailing us at listeningfirstpod@gmail.com or visit our website at listeningfirstpod.com.
Yeah, great. And I can't quite remember it, Patrick, which is a failing on my part, but I think Elizabeth finished the sort of episode with a reflection on what rehabilitation meant to her. Can you remember the exact phrase? It was something about music being, was it music is the tool?
Music is the tool that we use to do the work. So regardless of what you think about music, don't be limited by your assumptions. Music can do far more than you think it might do. And that is just so inspiring. So much so, actually, that I might end up getting in trouble with my wife because it's inspired me to go out and buy that electric drum kit that I've always wanted to get myself.
Are you going to do it, Patrick? Are you actually going to take the lead?
I'm going to do it, and I might be sleeping in your spare room.
Amazing, yeah. And it's also important to say we've got some more recording coming up, haven't we? Because we've got a real flurry of episodes coming up, and it's going to get hopefully better and better. And that's exciting.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, follow, and share the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, if you wouldn't mind, we'd really appreciate it if you would rate the podcast and even leave a comment, because that helps drive the podcast to more listeners who might be interested in this kind of content. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn at Listening First Podcast and on other social media platforms, including Instagram and Facebook. So thanks again to Elizabeth for joining us and to you, our listeners, for joining us as well. Thanks for being with us as we keep learning, keep sharing, and most importantly, keep listening first.